What you're about to see, gentlemen, is a series called The Twilight Zone. Next week on The Twilight Zone, we let you in on an extravagant practical joke. A man who wants to convey an illusion that the world is coming to an end.
Next week on The Twilight Zone, we let you in on an extravagant practical joke. A man trying to convince the world that it's about to end. Remember when TV didn't hold your hand? When a single half-hour episode could twist your mind, challenge your morals, and still leave you uneasy in black and white? Airing from 1959 to 1964 on CBS, The Twilight Zone wasn't just a show. It was a weekly step into the unknown, created and hosted by Rod Serling. It mixed science fiction, fantasy, and horror to explore fear, prejudice, greed, and human nature long before TV was ready for it. Today, we're counting down 13 strange facts about The Twilight Zone. And trust us, you won't believe what's waiting at number 1. 13. Censorship created the fifth dimension. Before The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling was already a respected writer with awards and critical success. But the real problem wasn't audiences, it was sponsors. In the 1950s, cigarette companies and appliance brands had major control over what made it to air. If a script made anyone uncomfortable, especially in certain regions, it was often heavily altered or completely rewritten. Serling hit his breaking point after writing a teleplay inspired by the real-life murder of Emmett Till. By the time sponsors and the network finished editing it, the story had been stripped of its setting, its racial context, and even the word lynching. What was meant to be a powerful statement on racial violence was completely defanged. That's when Serling realized something. If he set stories on distant planets or used robots instead of humans, the censors would stop paying attention. As he famously put it, a Martian can say things that a Republican or Democrat can't. So aliens, monsters, and supernatural twists became his disguise. Under the surface, he was still tackling racism, fear, and political paranoia, just in a form the networks didn't fully recognize. Ironically, censorship didn't silence him. It gave him a new language. 12. The script CBS tried to bury. Before The Twilight Zone even existed, CBS almost killed the idea entirely. In 1957, Rod Serling wrote a script called The Time Element. It had everything the future series would become known for: time travel, psychological tension, and a twist ending that sticks with you long after it ends. The story follows a man who keeps dreaming he's in Honolulu on December 6, 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor. Each night, the dream lasts longer, and he becomes convinced he's actually traveling through time and may die there. CBS executives hated it. Too confusing, too dark, too strange for television. So they did what networks often did back then. They bought it and locked it away in a drawer. But the story didn't end there. A year later, producer Burt Granett rediscovered the script and convinced Desi Arnaz to air it on Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. Despite doubts, it aired in 1958. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of letters flooded CBS. Viewers didn't just like it, they said it haunted them. The twist executives feared audiences wouldn't understand became the very thing they loved most. That reaction changed everything. CBS called Serling back, gave him creative control, and The Twilight Zone was born. One forgotten script became the key to a whole new dimension. 11. The narrator nobody wanted. When The Twilight Zone was first developed, Rod Serling never planned to be the narrator. He wanted a powerful theatrical voice, something almost otherworldly. Even Orson Welles was considered, but the price was too high. Other voices felt too polished or too generic. As deadlines approached, options ran out. Reluctantly, Serling stepped in himself. He didn't think he was a performer. He felt stiff on camera and believed his voice was too sharp and clipped. But there was no one else. So he appeared on screen, calm, direct, and almost detached, speaking straight to the audience like someone who already knew how the story would end. That tone became iconic. He often leaned into the set, speaking quietly, sometimes with a cigarette in hand. The smoke drifting through the frame became part of the atmosphere, and his voice, raspy, steady, and almost clinical, defined the entire series. What started as a backup plan turned into one of television's most recognizable narrations. Over time, his presence became inseparable from the show's identity. Even when the episodes changed tone or genre, Serling's introductions kept everything grounded. The creator who didn't want to be on camera ended up becoming the face of the show. 10. The theme song that was an accident. The iconic Twilight Zone theme wasn't always the version viewers instantly recognized today. For Season 1, Rod Serling brought in Bernard Herrmann, the legendary composer behind Psycho. His score was moody, elegant, and cinematic, but it didn't really stick in your head the way a theme song needs to. By Season 2, the producers wanted something sharper, stranger, and more unsettling. That's when they turned to composer Marius Constant. The twist is, he never actually wrote a theme in the traditional sense. Instead, he created short experimental music cues meant for a sound library. The producers then took two of those pieces, Étrange 3 and Milieu 2, and literally stitched them together. No grand orchestration, no polished arrangement, just a simple edit job. What came out of that accident was something unforgettable. 4 sharp notes, a jittery rhythm, and a sound that instantly feels like something is off. It didn't just introduce the show, it warned you. Over time, it became one of the most recognizable pieces of television music ever created, instantly triggering that feeling of unease and curiosity in just a few seconds. Even more surprising, Constant didn't even realize how iconic it had become until years later, when royalty checks started arriving and the theme kept showing up everywhere. A piece of background library music accidentally turned into television history and proved that sometimes the most famous sounds in the world aren't carefully designed. They're discovered. 9. Before they were legends. The Twilight Zone didn't just tell great stories, it helped create future legends. Before he became Captain Kirk, William Shatner gave one of the most unforgettable performances in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, as a passenger who sees a creature on the wing and completely unravels. It wasn't a one-time thing either. His role in Nick of Time, where he becomes obsessed with a fortune-telling machine, shows how the series often pushed actors into intense psychological territory. Burt Reynolds also appeared before his superstar rise in The Bard, already showing the charm and timing that would later define his career. Robert Redford played Death in Nothing in the Dark, delivering a calm, emotional performance that turned a simple idea into something hauntingly human. Burgess Meredith became one of the show's most memorable recurring actors, starring in classics like Time Enough at Last, where his performance became iconic. Even background actor Robert McCord became a familiar face, popping up so often that fans still enjoy spotting him across different episodes. The Twilight Zone didn't just cast actors, it tested them, often stripping away polish and forcing raw performances that revealed what they could really do under pressure. Part of what made that possible was the show's anthology format. There were no long character arcs to hide behind, just one episode, one role, and no second chances if the performance didn't land. That pressure created an unusual environment where rising actors could either stumble or deliver something unforgettable in a very short time. Because of that, many performers later said appearing on the show felt like a rite of passage. It wasn't just another credit, it was a proving ground where imagination did most of the heavy lifting, and actors had to keep up with stories that constantly bent reality. 8. Filmed fast, like really fast. The Twilight Zone didn't just move fast, it moved at full sprint. Most TV dramas in that era needed around 10 to 12 days per episode. The Twilight Zone, about 8 days total, start to finish. That meant maybe a day or two for prep, a few brutal shooting days packed with long hours, and then barely any time for editing and narration before it aired. Scripts often arrived late, sometimes right before filming, since Rod Serling wrote a huge chunk of them himself. Actors would show up, get handed dense philosophical dialogue, and just run with it. Rehearsals were minimal, sometimes almost non-existent. Because of the pace, episodes often feel a bit raw and theatrical, like live TV with a safety net that's barely there, but that chaos also protected the show creatively. CBS executives didn't have much time to interfere before episodes were already done. It was exhausting, though. By the end, Serling was burned out and looked far older than his age. That breakneck production style also meant mistakes slipped through, with continuity errors and off-camera moments, but the show embraced them instead of reshooting. Weeks of overlap fueled efficiency on set. 7. Life imitating a very dark script. Sometimes The Twilight Zone didn't just tell strange stories, it accidentally lined up with real life. In The Purple Testament, William Reynolds plays a soldier who can see a glow on people who are about to die. It's already a heavy idea, but it gets darker when the glow eventually appears on him too. Then, something even stranger happened. On the same day the episode aired, Reynolds and director Richard Bear were involved in a small plane crash. They both survived, but the timing was eerie enough that people still talk about it. Reynolds didn't make much of it publicly and went on to live a long life, but the coincidence stuck with fans. It's one of those cases where fiction and reality feel uncomfortably close, which is exactly the kind of thing Rod Serling was always circling in his work. Some viewers even pointed out how the episode's themes of inevitability and fate seemed to echo the accident in a way that felt almost scripted. Of course, there's no real connection, just coincidence, but it reinforced the show's reputation for uncanny timing. Over the years, fans have collected other moments where real events seem to mirror episode plots, feeding into its mythic status. These overlaps helped blur the line between storytelling and lived experience, making The Twilight Zone feel less like fiction and more like a strange commentary on reality itself. 6. Backlot worlds and budget tricks. A lot of The Twilight Zone looked expensive. It wasn't. Most episodes were built using whatever was already available on studio backlots. Neighborhoods, sci-fi sets, even costumes were often recycled from older films and shows. Maple Street from The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street was just a real backlot street dressed up differently. Space gear was often repurposed military or old movie props. Roman outfits, straight from studio costume storage. Black and white filming actually helped a lot. It hid cheap materials, painted wood, and reused sets in shadows that made everything feel more cinematic than it really was. Cinematographers like George T. Clemens leaned into lighting tricks to make small budgets look bigger than they were. CBS even tried switching the show to videotape at one point to save money. It looked so flat and lifeless that the experiment was quickly abandoned. In the end, the show proved something simple. Good lighting and good ideas can hide a lot of budget problems. Directors would often reframe shots tightly to avoid showing edges of sets, while fog, smoke, and darkness were used to stretch limited space into something that felt larger and more mysterious on screen. 5. The most expensive shot in the show. Even though The Twilight Zone was usually low budget, it occasionally went big, sometimes too big. The Odyssey of Flight 33 is a good example. It follows a passenger jet that somehow travels through time, flying past dinosaurs and future cities. For a half-hour show, it was ambitious, maybe even reckless. One of the most expensive parts was a stop-motion dinosaur shot borrowed from another film, which cost thousands of dollars on its own. Producer Buck Houghton later admitted CBS wasn't thrilled about how much that episode spent. But here's the funny part. The episodes people remember most weren't the expensive ones. They were the simple ones, like Time Enough at Last, which mostly takes place in a single room. The show worked best when it relied on ideas instead of spectacle. A broken pair of glasses or an empty library ended up being more memorable than any dinosaur. In the end, budget rarely predicted impact. Some of the cheapest setups delivered the strongest emotional punch, proving that imagination was the real special effect behind the series. 4. Why it's called The Twilight Zone. The title actually comes from aviation. Pilots used the term Twilight Zone to describe a dangerous moment during takeoff or landing in low light or fog. At that point, it becomes hard to tell where the horizon is, and your senses can trick you into thinking you're climbing when you're actually descending. It's a confusing, unstable space where nothing feels reliable, even if everything looks normal. Rod Serling, who served in World War II, understood that feeling deeply. He'd experienced the uncertainty of flight and war firsthand. That idea became the foundation of the show. Not pure darkness, but something in between, where reality starts to slip just slightly. The name also carried a second meaning. It sounded scientific enough to feel real, but mysterious enough to feel unsettling. Serling described it as the space between fear and understanding, where logic stops making sense and imagination takes over. Over time, the phrase escaped the show itself and became part of everyday language. Now, when something feels strange or unexplainable, people just say it feels like the Twilight Zone. 3. Disney brought Serling back. Kind of. Disney did something pretty wild with the Twilight Zone. They basically brought Rod Serling back from the dead, in a way. At the Tower of Terror ride, Serling returns as the host, introducing guests to the haunted elevator story. But here's the twist. Not all of that voice is actually him. They used real archival audio of Serling and mixed it with voice actor Mark Silverman, carefully matched so it sounds seamless. Even the recording style was recreated to feel like old TV audio, down to the static and tone. There's also a subtle detail most people miss. Serling's cigarette was digitally removed due to Disney's no-smoking rules, leaving his hand slightly awkward and empty in some shots. The ride is packed with deep-cut references too, props and Easter eggs from classic episodes like Time Enough at Last and To Serve Man. It's not just a ride, it's basically a love letter to the Twilight Zone disguised as a drop tower. 2. The deal that cost Serling millions. When the Twilight Zone ended, TV was still seen as disposable. Once a show aired, it usually disappeared. So, when CBS offered Rod Serling a buyout in 1964, around $600,000 for a big chunk of ownership, it sounded like a solid exit deal. Serling took it, thinking the show would fade away like most TV at the time. Black and white morality stories didn't seem built to last. But then reruns exploded, syndication took off, and suddenly the Twilight Zone was everywhere. Constant marathons, late-night reruns, endless broadcasts across decades and networks. The irony? Those dated stories about paranoia, greed, and fear never stopped being relevant. They aged in a way few expected, because the themes were never tied to technology or fashion, only to human behavior. If Serling had kept his share, it likely would have turned into hundreds of millions over time, especially as television libraries became valuable intellectual property. Instead, the money went elsewhere, and he kept writing and working for the rest of his life, including Night Gallery. His wife, Carol Serling, later helped protect and preserve his legacy, so his name stayed tied to the show he created. In a way, it's the most Twilight Zone twist possible. He wrote stories about ironic fate and lived one, the ending that never lets you go. Most TV shows just end. The Twilight Zone doesn't really do that. One of the most memorable endings in the series is the spinning spiral, black and white lines twisting into what feels like infinity. Instead of a clean fade-out, it feels like the show is looping you back in, like it's not over yet. It's simple, but it messes with your head. There's no closure, just this strange feeling that something is still going on underneath everything. That was kind of the whole point of the Twilight Zone. The stories don't really finish, they echo. Even the moral of the episode doesn't feel final. It follows you after the credits, like you're part of the story now. That's why people still talk about it decades later. It doesn't stay on the screen, it stays in your head. And honestly, that's what made it scary. Not monsters or aliens, but the idea that reality itself might not be as solid as it looks. Once you've seen it, it kind of sticks with you. That lingering effect was reinforced by Rod Serling's closing narration, which often reframed everything you just watched in a colder, more unsettling way. Instead of comfort, he gave reflection, sometimes even warning. The result is that each episode feels less like a story with an ending and more like a door quietly closing behind you. And that wraps up 13 weird facts about the Twilight Zone, one of the most influential and unforgettable shows in TV history. From behind-the-scenes chaos and clever production tricks to real-life moments that felt straight out of the script, it's clear the show was far ahead of its time. Now we want to hear from you. What fact surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still gets creeped out by old black and white TV. And remember, some shows end when the credits roll. The Twilight Zone doesn't.